ஹாய், வெல்கம் டு டாக்டர் மெடிக்ஸ். இன்னைக்கு நம்ம என்ன பார்க்க போறோம்னு பார்த்தோம்னா ஹைபோதலாமஸ் அதோட physiology. The ninth function of a hypothalamus is the regulation of hunger and food intake. To regulate the hunger and food intake, there are two centers in the hypothalamus, which are the feeding center and the satiety center. Basically, the feeding center will induce the hunger and satiety center will produce the I am full sensation. So the first one is the feeding center. It is located in the lateral hypothalamic nucleus. They have done experimental conditions in animals that shows the stimulation of lateral hypothalamic nucleus center in animals leads to the uncontrolled hunger and increased food intake, which is known as the hyperphagia. This will lead to the obesity. Destruction of this feeding center will lead to the loss of appetite, which is the anorexia, so that the animal refuses to take food. Normally, the feeding center is always active, which means it has tendency to induce the food intake always. Now the satiety center. The satiety center is located in the ventromedial nucleus in the hypothalamus. Same as the feeding center, they have done the experimental conditions in animals. Stimulation of ventromedial nucleus center of hypothalamus in animals causes the total loss of appetite and cessation of food intake. So the another test is destruction of satiety center, which leads to the hyperphagia, that is the increased food intake, which is uncontrolled, that will lead to the obesity. And this type of obesity is called the hypothalamic obesity. So, satiety center plays an important role in the regulation of food intake by temporarily inhibition of the feeding center after the food intake. Mechanism of regulation of food. Under normal physiological conditions, appetite and food intake are well balanced and continues in a very cyclical manner. This appetite and food intake are regulated by the feeding center and satiety center. These are the centers responsible for the regulation of appetite and food intake. So these steps are regulated by the following mechanisms. There are 5 mechanisms. One is the glucostatic mechanism, lipostatic mechanism, peptide mechanism, hormonal mechanism, and thermostatic mechanism. So the first one is the glucostatic mechanism. There are cells in the satiety center which is known as the glucostats or the glucose receptors. Usually the satiety center will inhibit the hunger and give the sensation of fullness, stops the overheating. But in some cases they won't do these works properly. The glucostats, which are the glucose receptors, they don't give response to very high level of glucose, which results in fail to stimulate the satiety cells or the center. That leads to does not inhibit the feeding center. This increases the frequency of food intake, which is known as the polyphagia. This metabolism undergoes in the diabetes mellitus and hyperglycemia. Second mechanism is the lipostatic mechanism. In this mechanism, leptin is an enzyme which plays a major role in controlling the food intake and adipose tissue volume. It is a peptide secreted by the adipocytes, the cells of the adipose tissue. So looking into the mechanism, when there is the adipose tissue increases, there will be increase in the adipocytes, which is the cells of the adipose tissue. These cells secrete and release leptin in a very large amount into the blood. This blood, which is large in the amount of leptin, crosses the blood-brain barrier in the hypothalamus. In hypothalamus, the leptin inhibits the feeding center and induces the loss of appetite and stop of the food intake. The cells present in the blood-brain barrier has receptors like proteins which are responsible for transport of leptin across the barriers to reach the hypothalamus. Mode of action of leptin. Leptin acts through the neuropeptide in the hypothalamus. This neuropeptide has two peptides. One is neuropeptide Y and another one is pro-opiomelanocortin. So, the neuropeptide Y is secreted in small intestine, medulla and hypothalamus. So, the function of neuropeptide Y is to stimulate the food intake normally. In mechanism of the leptin inhibits the neuropeptide Y and that induces the stoppage of food intake. On the other hand, pro-opiomelanocortin secreted from anterior pituitary, hypothalamus, lungs, GI tract and placenta. The function of this pump is normally inhibits the food intake. So in the leptin mechanism, the leptin stimulates the pump and that naturally inhibits the food intake. Leptin receptors. Many leptin receptors are identified. However, leptin acts through LEP-RB. This is the only active receptors present in the nuclei of hypothalamus. Third mechanism is peptide mechanism. Some peptides regulate food intake either by stimulate or inhibit the feeding center directly or indirectly. The most important one among the peptide is ghrelin. Ghrelin is secreted by stomach during the fasting. The ghrelin directly stimulates the feeding center and increases the appetite and food intake. Besides ghrelin, there are several other peptides which are involved in regulation of the food intake. The peptides which increases the food intake are ghrelin and neuropeptide Y. The peptides that decrease food intake are leptin and the peptide YY. Fourth mechanism is the hormonal mechanism. This hormonal mechanism involves some hormones from endocrine and GI tract also. The hormones inhibit food intake through hypothalamus. There are 5 hormones that inhibit the food intake: somatostatin, oxytocin, glucagon, pancreatic polypeptide, cholecystokinin. Fifth mechanism is the thermostatic mechanism. Food intake inversely proportional to the body temperature. If a person has a fever, there will be a decrease in the food intake. The fact of this mechanism is unknown. It is suggested that the preoptic thermoreceptors act via feeding center. The cytokines also suggested to play a vital role in decreasing the appetite during the fever. The 10th function of hypothalamus is regulation of water balance. This includes the 2 mechanism, which is thirst mechanism and antidiuretic hormone ADH mechanism. First, the thirst mechanism. There are thirst centers which is located in the lateral nucleus of hypothalamus, and there are osmoreceptors which is adjacent to the thirst center. So when the ECF volume decreases, the osmolality of ECF increases. When the osmolality of ECF increases by 1 to 2%, the osmoreceptors stimulated, in turn activate the thirst center. Now the person feels thirsty and drinks water. Water intake increases the ECF volume and decreases the osmolality. Simultaneously, the ADH mechanism will also occur. The ECF volume decreases, in turn the osmolality volume increases. So the supraoptic nucleus in the hypothalamus gets stimulated and ADH is released, causing the retention of water by reabsorption in renal tubules, which leads to the increased ECF and decreased osmolality into the normal levels. The 11th function of hypothalamus is regulation of sleep and wakefulness. Mammillary body in the posterior hypothalamus is responsible for the wakefulness center. So if the person has to awake, there will be a stimulation in the mammillary body, so the person will be awakefulness. If there is a lesion or a tumor in the mammillary body, that leads to the sleep. So if a person has to sleep, there will be a stimulation of anterior hypothalamus that leads to the sleep. 12th function of hypothalamus is the role in behavior and emotional changes. Behavior of animals and human beings is mostly affected by 2 responding systems in hypothalamus and other structures of limbic system. Responding system is concerned with affective nature of sensations, that is pleasure or painfulness. These 2 qualities are called the reward, which is satisfaction, punishment, which is aversion or avoidance. Hypothalamus has 2 centers for behavioral and emotional changes, that is reward center and punishment center. First one is the reward center. This is situated in the medial forebrain bundles and ventromedial nucleus of hypothalamus. Electrical stimulation of these areas will lead to pleases or satisfices in human beings or animals. Second one is the punishment center. It is situated in the posterior and lateral nuclei of hypothalamus. Electrical stimulation of these areas lead to pain, fear, defense, escape reactions. Role of reward and punishment center. Importance of reward and punishment center lies in behavioral pattern of individuals. Almost all the activities of day-to-day life depend upon reward and punishment. While doing something, the person rewarded or feels satisfied, he or she continues to do so. If a person feels punished or unpleasant, he or she stops doing so. These 2 centers play an important role in the development of behavioral pattern of the person. Rage. Rage refers to violent and aggressive emotional expression with extreme anger, which is developed by stimulating punishment centers present in the posterior and lateral hypothalamus. These reactions are expressed by developing the defense posture in animals. The defense postures are of 7: extension of limbs, lifting of tail, hissing and spitting, piloerection, wide opening of eyeballs, dilatation of pupil, severe savage attack even by mild provocation. Shame rage, which is also known as false rage. What is false rage? It is extreme emotional conditions that resembles rage, which is occur in pathological conditions in human beings. Physiological conditions in animals and human beings maintain the balance between rage and its opposite state. These balanced state or balanced condition is called the calm emotional state. Major irritation leads to loose temper. Minor irritations are usually ignored or overcome. It is because the inhibitory influence of cerebral cortex on hypothalamus, but the calm emotional state which is altered during brain lesions. Some cases, the mild stimulus evokes false rage. The false rage due to the release of hypothalamus from the inhibitory influence of cortical control. 13th function of hypothalamus is the regulation of sexual function. In animals, hypothalamus plays an important role in maintaining the sexual function, especially in the females. Females have regular estrous cycle. In human beings, hypothalamus regulates the sexual function by secreting gonadotropin-releasing hormones. The arcuate and posterior hypothalamic nuclei in the hypothalamus are involved in the regulation of the sexual function. 14th function of hypothalamus is the role in response to the smell. Posterior hypothalamus, hippocampus, and brainstem nuclei are responsible for the response to the smell. These are responsible to the autonomic responses of the body to olfactory stimuli. These responses include feeding activities and emotional responses like fear, excitement, and pleasure. 15th function, that is the last function of the hypothalamus, is role in circadian rhythm. What is circadian rhythm? Regular recurrence of physiology process or activities which occur in cycles of 24 hours. The circadian rhythm is also known as diurnal rhythm. Circadian rhythm develops a response to the recurring daylight and the darkness. Cyclic changes taking place in various psychological processes, that is internal clock, which often called as biological clock. Suprachiasmatic nuclei is responsible for the biological clock by connection with retina via retinohypothalamic fibers. Suprachiasmatic nuclei through afferent fibers send circadian signals to different parts and maintain the circadian rhythm of sleep, hormonal secretion, thirst, hunger, appetite, etc. Whenever the body is exposed to the new pattern, there will be a new biological clock, and the biological clock will automatically reset, which in turn provided the new pattern, that is circadian changes.